The entire timeline of the Middle Ages explained in 30 minutes. Somewhere in the ruins of a great empire, a soldier drops his sword into the mud and walks away from a wall he has been ordered to defend for the last time. Behind him, a city that once ruled the known world is burning. In front of him lies 1,000 years of darkness, war, plague, cathedrals, kings, and secrets that the modern world has almost completely forgotten. You are standing at the edge of that 1,000 years now. The road ahead is long. The cities you know do not exist yet. The countries you know have no names. The languages you speak are being invented as we speak. In the mouths of villagers who will never know, their words survived. And the men and women who will shape the next 10 centuries have not yet been born. Everything is about to change in ways so slow and so strange that no one alive to watch it happen will fully understand what they are living through. This wasn't a single age. This wasn't a single story. What we call the Middle Ages was a 1,000-year storm of collapse, rebirth, terror, and reinvention that made the modern world possible and almost destroyed it several times along the way. And tonight, we're walking through all of it, from the last day of Rome to the first breath of the modern world. Welcome to Medieval Secrets Unlocked, the world that fell first. Picture yourself as a farmer standing at the edge of a Roman road, the kind that once carried legions, merchants, and messengers from one end of an empire to the other. The stones are still there beneath your feet. The roads still run straight, as only Roman roads ran straight. But the wagons have stopped coming. The soldiers have stopped patrolling. And the great city that lay at the end of this road is no longer answering the letters that villages like yours have been sending for generations. Something has broken. No one has told you what. This is the beginning of the medieval world. Not a single event. Not a single battle. A slow, terrible fading of the world your grandfather knew. Rome, the empire that had shaped everything from language to law to the pattern of the streets in your town, was cracking apart under pressures it could no longer contain. Rome, the empire that had shaped everything from language to law to the pattern of the streets in your town, was cracking apart under pressures it could no longer contain. Waves of people from the north and east were pressing against its borders, driven from their own homes by other people's pressing on them, in a chain reaction that stretched all the way across the vast plains of Asia. Emperors were being killed by their own generals almost yearly. The armies were unpaid. The taxes were uncollected. The roads were unguarded. And then, in the 5th century, the unthinkable happened. Rome itself, the eternal city, was sacked. Not once. Twice. By armies its own citizens had once dismissed as barbarians. The news traveled slowly across the empire. In some distant provinces, villagers did not even hear about it for months. But when they did, they understood, in the pit of their stomachs, that the world had changed forever. Now picture what it actually felt like in a small provincial town when the last Roman official finally left. There was no ceremony. There was no farewell. One morning, the small garrison that had been stationed on the hill was simply gone, along with the tax collector and the magistrate. The doors of the official buildings hung open. The bathhouse stopped being heated. The aqueduct began to leak, and no one came to repair it. Within a generation, children in that town would grow up believing the great stone buildings around them had been built by giants, because no one they knew could imagine how mere men could have raised such walls. Here's what history books rarely tell you. For most ordinary people, the fall of Rome did not look like a disaster in a single day. It looked like a long, quiet slide. The market that had been busy grew smaller. The coins that had been silver grew thinner. The stranger who once came selling spices from the east stopped appearing. The garrison at the fort on the hill packed up one night and never returned. Nobody rang a bell. Nobody made a speech. The greatest civilization the West had ever known simply stopped answering. That silence was the sound of the medieval world being born. The centuries the light went low. For the next several hundred years, Europe entered the period that later writers, unfairly but memorably, called the Dark Ages. The label is misleading. It was not a time of stupidity. It was a time of survival. Picture the roads now, a century after Rome's collapse. The great paved highways are cracking. Grass grows between the stones. Bridges have washed out, and nobody has come to rebuild them. The towns that once held tens of thousands are down to hundreds. Some have been abandoned entirely, their houses roofless, their wells choked with leaves, their forums slowly being reclaimed by trees. Wolves are heard again in places where wolves had not walked for centuries. In the countryside, people live smaller lives, tighter lives, more suspicious lives. A stranger on the road is a threat until he proves otherwise. Into this world came new peoples. Franks, Saxons, Visigoths, Lombards, Angles, Jutes. Kingdoms rose in weeks and collapsed in months. Kings were often little more than warlords with a slightly better cloak. Laws were spoken, not written. Justice was decided by trial, by ordeal, by combat, by the swearing of oaths in front of witnesses. If you were accused of a crime, you might be asked to carry a red-hot iron for a certain number of steps to prove your innocence. If your hand healed cleanly, God had spoken in your favor. If it did not, you were guilty. It was a system that terrifies the modern mind. To the people using it, it was the fairest thing they could imagine because it placed the final judgment in hands higher than any human court. But even in this dimmer world, one institution refused to die: the Christian Church. As the empire crumbled, the Church quietly picked up the pieces. It preserved books when almost no one else could read. It kept records when almost no one else was writing. In small stone monasteries scattered across the countryside, monks bent over candlelit desks and copied the great works of the ancient world, letter by letter, generation by generation, for reasons even they sometimes struggled to explain. Picture one of those monks now. He is young. His fingers are stained with ink. The room he sits in is so cold that his breath forms clouds above the page. The book he is copying was written by a Roman 1,000 miles away and 5 centuries earlier, in a world he can barely imagine. He does not fully understand every word. He does not know that in a distant future, scholars will read the very lines he is now shaping with a trembling hand. He only knows that his abbot has told him this work matters, and that the words on this page must not be lost. Here's what history books won't tell you. Much of the knowledge we have today from the ancient world survived only because a handful of medieval monks decided, in the middle of a collapsing civilization, that certain words were worth saving. Without them, entire libraries of human thought would be gone. The candle they held up was small, but it never went out. That candle is the beginning of every European university, every printing press, every modern school. It flickered for centuries in rooms so cold the ink froze in the wells. And it was enough. The empire that almost came back. Now imagine, a few centuries later, a tall man on horseback riding through a field of freshly cut wheat. His beard is streaked with gray. His crown is simple. Behind him ride the most disciplined soldiers Europe has seen since Rome. And in front of him lies something no one had thought possible for 300 years. A united Christian empire in the West. His name was Charles, and history would eventually call him Charlemagne, meaning Charles the Great. He was the first ruler since the fall of Rome to bind most of Western Europe under a single crown. He fought long, bloody campaigns against pagan peoples in the north and east, forcing conversion with the sword in ways that later ages would find deeply uncomfortable. He built palaces where scholars gathered. He ordered churches raised in stone in places that had known only wood. He gathered around him the finest minds he could find, from Ireland to Italy, and made his court a small island of learning in a wide, dark sea. And here is a detail almost no one remembers. Charlemagne, ruler of half a continent, tried to teach himself to read as an adult. He kept a wax tablet under his pillow at night so he could practice writing letters when he could not sleep. He never fully mastered it. But the effort itself tells you something extraordinary about him, and about a world in which even a king could understand, in the pit of his soul, that power without learning eventually collapses back into brutality. On a Christmas day, in a great church in Rome, the Pope placed a crown on his head and declared him emperor. It was a moment that stunned Europe. The Roman title, which had lain empty in the West for centuries, was suddenly alive again. For a brief shining moment, the medieval world seemed to remember what it had once been. But here's what history books rarely tell you. Charlemagne's empire did not survive him. His grandsons tore into pieces, dividing his lands into kingdoms that would eventually become France, Germany, and much of the territory in between. The great experiment cracked apart within a single lifetime after his death. Cousins fought cousins. Brothers murdered brothers. The armies that Charlemagne had disciplined into instruments of policy became, once again, the tools of small men fighting small wars. But the idea of it, the memory of a united Christian Europe under a single crowned emperor, refused to die. It would shape political dreams and political nightmares for the next 1,000 years. Every ruler who ever tried to reunite Europe by force, right down into modern times, was in some sense chasing the ghost of Charlemagne. And then, just as the pieces of his empire were still settling, a new terror came out of the sea. The men from the northern seas. Picture yourself as a monk in a small monastery on a remote European coast on a quiet summer morning. The sea is calm. The bell is calling the brothers to prayer. You look up from your garden and see, on the horizon, a shape you have never seen before. Long, low ships with striped sails, cutting through the water faster than anything you have ever known. There are more of them than you can count. They will be on the beach within the hour. And by nightfall, the monastery you have lived in your entire life will be a smoking ruin. For roughly 3 centuries, the Vikings poured out of Scandinavia and struck coasts, rivers, and cities across Europe. They were traders when it suited them and raiders when it did not. They settled parts of what is now England, France, Ireland, and even reached lands as far as the edge of North America, centuries before Columbus was born. They settled parts of what is now England. They settled parts of what is now France. They settled parts of what is now Ireland, and even reached lands as far as the edge of North America, centuries before Columbus was born. They founded kingdoms. They served as elite guards to distant emperors in cities so far east that most Europeans had never heard the name. They opened trade routes that stretched from the frozen north to the markets of the Middle East, moving furs, amber, and slaves along rivers no southern merchant would have dared to travel. Now, picture the horror of being on the receiving end of one of their raids. You are a village woman on the coast. You have heard the stories, but you have never seen it yourself. You're grinding grain in your doorway when the first bell rings from the monastery on the cliff. Not the slow bell of prayer. The fast, frightened bell of alarm. You look up. On the water, the sails are already close enough to count. You grab your children. You run and land with what you can carry on your back. Behind you, the smoke begins to rise. You may live. You may not. If the raiders catch you, you may end your life as a slave in a market 1,000 miles from home. Given a new name in a language you do not yet speak. Remembered by your family only as someone who once walked out the door and never came back. This happened over and over in the accounts of the Viking Age. It is the quiet horror behind the horned helmet romance of later storytelling. But do not simplify the Vikings either. For every village they burned, they also built one. In the towns they founded, they held councils that were among the earliest experiments in something like open political debate. Their poets memorized long, intricate epics that we still read today. Their explorers pushed further into unknown oceans than almost any Europeans of their age. What is truly remarkable is how this terror ended. It ended not through defeat, but through absorption. The Vikings became Normans in France, kings in England, dukes in the Mediterranean. They accepted Christianity. They intermarried. They built cathedrals in the same regions they had once burned. Within a few generations, the wolves had become nobles. That is one of the strangest patterns of the medieval world. The peoples who most terrified Europe often became, within a century or two, the ones who ruled it. The age of castles and cathedrals. Now step forward past the end of the Viking terrors into the world that took shape after. Around the 10th and 11th centuries, something began to change across Europe. The population grew. Fields were cleared. Better plows turned heavier soils that no Roman farmer had ever managed to break. Windmills appeared on hillsides. Water mills clattered along every stream strong enough to turn a wheel. Trade came back to life. And on every hilltop, in every strategic pass, in every river bend, something new began to rise. Castles. Picture the first time a castle appeared in your village. It began as a wooden tower on a raised mound of earth, ringed by a ditch. Within a generation, it had become stone. Within 2 generations, it had walls thick enough to swallow arrows from any bow ever made. The lord who lived inside was your protector, your judge, your landlord, and, if he chose, your executioner. He collected your grain. He decided your marriages. He rode out at his own pleasure to fight other lords in wars that had almost nothing to do with you, and to which you sent your sons and your food regardless. This was feudalism, a system in which every person had a place, and every place had a duty. Peasants owed labor to lords. Lords owed service to greater lords. Greater lords owed loyalty to kings. Kings owed reverence to popes. The whole society was imagined as a great chain, from the tip of the crown to the humblest field, with everyone locked into their place by birth. For most people, this meant a life of unbelievably hard work in exchange for very little. You worked your lord's land several days a week before you were allowed to work your own. You paid a portion of your harvest to the Lord, another to the church, and hoped that what remained would carry your family through winter. You paid a portion of your harvest to the Lord, another to the church, and hoped that what remained would carry your family through winter. You could not leave the village where you were born without permission. You could not marry without permission. In some places, you could not even inherit your father's tools or animals without paying a fee to your lord for the privilege. And yet, do not imagine these people as broken or hopeless. They sang. They laughed. They gathered at fairs. They fell in love, argued with their neighbors, told jokes about their lord behind their backs, and lived rich inner lives inside the narrow world their birth had assigned them. The medieval peasant was not the miserable creature of later cartoons. He was a human being who had learned, out of necessity, how to be joyful inside very tight walls. At the same time, another kind of building was rising alongside the castles. Cathedrals. Vast stone churches with vaulted ceilings, stained glass windows that turned sunlight into scenes from Scripture, and towers that seemed to touch the sky. Some of them took over a century to build. Entire generations of masons were born, worked, and died on the same cathedral. A man might inherit his father's chisel and use it on the same wall his father had shaped. Here's what almost no one thinks about. The people who started these cathedrals knew they would never see them finished. They shaped stone for a building they would never worship in. That kind of patience is almost incomprehensible to the modern mind. It tells you something about the medieval imagination and about a world in which time was measured not in weeks or years, but in the length of a soul's journey toward eternity. Castles for the body, cathedrals for the soul. That was the shape of the high medieval world. The holy wars that remade Europe. Now, come with me to a great open field where thousands of people have gathered to hear a pope speak. It is late in the 11th century. The pope is calling for something that has never quite been done before. A war, not for land, not for gold, but for a city, Jerusalem. A holy war, blessed by heaven, promising forgiveness of sins to any man who takes up arms and marches east. You're standing in that crowd. You see grown men fall to their knees weeping. You see peasants tearing pieces of cloth into rough crosses and pinning them to their tunics. Within months, tens of thousands of Europeans, knights and paupers alike, will be walking across a continent toward lands most of them cannot even imagine. This was the first of the Crusades. There would be many more over the next 2 centuries. Some ended in stunning victories. Most ended in disaster. Armies starved in deserts. Ships sank in storms. Whole populations, on all sides, were massacred in cities whose names still echo darkly through history. Picture one of these long marches. A young man from a small village in the north of France. He has never been more than a day's walk from his own church. Now he is trudging through mountains he has no name for, past rivers whose language he cannot read. With the weight of armor, he barely knows how to wear pressing on shoulders that have been shaped only by farm work. His feet are bleeding inside his boots. Half the men who set out beside him are already dead of illness, hunger, or ambush, and he has not yet even seen the walls of the city he was told he was coming to save. The suffering on all sides of the Crusades was immense. Christian armies committed atrocities that shocked even chroniclers of their own faith. Muslim armies, defending their homelands, fought with a discipline and sophistication that many European knights had not expected to encounter. Cities changed hands. Alliances shifted. Kings betrayed one another. And in the middle of it all, ordinary people, farmers, mothers, children, prayed simply that the armies of any faith would pass by their village without stopping. But the Crusades did something else, something quieter, that reshaped the medieval world forever. They opened the door between Europe and the wider world. Knights and merchants came back with silks, spices, books, mathematics, medical knowledge, and ideas that Europe had almost forgotten it once knew. The learning of the Islamic world, which had preserved and expanded on ancient Greek thought, flowed into Christian Europe through this bloody, uneven contact. Here's the twist that changes everything. The wars that were fought in the name of one faith ended up feeding the intellectual rebirth of the other. European universities began to rise. In Bologna, Paris, Oxford, scholars began arguing about logic, about theology, about the shape of the natural world, in ways that would eventually blossom into the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. The seeds of the modern world were being carried, unknowingly, on the horses of returning crusaders. The medieval age was not standing still. It was reaching, sometimes with a sword and sometimes with a book, towards something it could not yet name. The order that almost broke. By the 13th century, Europe had reached something like a peak. The population was